You're listening to an ECGI podcast on corporate power and the politics of change with Matteo Gatti.
BlackRock is one of the largest investors on the planet, with over $14 trillion of assets under management. Its CEO Larry Fink writes to the CEOs of virtually every major company in the world. For a while, around the turn of the decade, Fink had told corporate CEOs that climate risk is a major existential risk with enormous impact on global investments, and that corporations had to act. Hundreds of companies acted accordingly. They updated their purpose statements, their disclosures, they hired chief sustainability officers, they set up committees, and importantly, they made commitments. For a moment, it all felt as if the stars were aligned for sustainability advocates. The Business Roundtable had seemingly declared that shareholder primacy was over and a new era of stakeholder capitalism had begun, or so we were told. Fast forward to now. BlackRock has quietly retreated from almost every ESG commitment he had made. Meanwhile, and not by coincidence, Texas had passed legislation barring state pension funds from doing business with firms that boycotted the fossil fuel industry. More than 20 states had followed. BlackRock CEO stopped writing about climate in his annual letter. The once ubiquitous expression ESG had become, in his own words, too politicized to use. The era of stakeholder capitalism had ended, or at least gone underground, before it had really begun. My book is about corporations as political actors, firms that step into contested terrain, take positions, and try to govern in spaces that state has vacated or is not willing to occupy. The story my guest tells is about what happens when politics strikes back, about why the effort to use shareholder pressure to move corporate America on climate and to tackle other market failures was almost certainly doomed from the start. Not because the economics were wrong, not because the executives were sincere, but because the same political forces that blocked politics from acting were always lying in wait for the private route as well. The question that sits at the end of the story is the hardest one. If the state won't act and the private route is blocked, who is left? Who is a viable reformer? I'm Matteo Gatti. This is Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, an ECGI podcast. Stay with us. Welcome to Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, an ECGI podcast. I'm Matteo Gatti, professor of law at Rutgers Law School, research member of the European Corporate Governance Institute, and the author of Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, published by Cambridge University Press. My book is about what I call corporate governing, the phenomenon by which corporations step into contested socioeconomic and political spaces, taking positions and making choices that once belonged to governments. It is a book about corporations as political actors and about what happens when politics pushes back. My guest today has spent decades at the intersection between corporate governance and politics. Several of his books, from the seminal Strong Managers, Weak Owners to Political Determinants of Corporate Governance, establish it's mainly politics and not the legal system on its own that has produced the divergent ownership and governance structures we see across capitalist economies. The books I just mentioned are amongst the top 8 most cited legal books since World War II. So theorize concepts that are part of our established lexicon, such as path dependence and germane to today's episode, backlash. In fact, in 1998, he mapped the concept of political backlash against corporate arrangements that had spontaneously emerged and taken hold in markets. In 2021, he showed that even if firms want to pursue a broader social purpose, competitive market structures make that aspiration unaffordable for most of them. And this year, he has offered a careful, rigorous account of why shareholder-driven corporate social responsibility, the great hope of the last decade, failed, and why it was structurally unlikely to succeed from the beginning. Mark Rowe is the David Berg Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, an ECGI Fellow, one of the most influential corporate law scholars of his generation, someone I'm proud to have studied with as a younger version of me. Mark, welcome. I'm flattered you have joined me here.
That's a very nice introduction for me, Matteo. I'm glad that you got started in the corporations course and the seminar in which we did excerpts of one book that was published and one book that was on its way. And it's very satisfying to see us here a few decades later doing the same thing, politics and corporate governance. And you've got a book now to join the other two.
Yes, and we look exactly the same. So, there you go. So before we get into the new paper, I want to give the listeners a sense of the intellectual arc that brings us here. So your 1998 Columbia Law Review piece on backlash established something that has almost become axiomatic in how we all think about corporate governance, that political actors can and do mobilize to override market-led equilibria. And so whatever looks like a stable, efficient corporate arrangement is always potentially fragile in the face of organized political opposition. So, how do you see the relationship between your 1998 insight and the argument you're making now, almost 30 years later?
So a couple of things. Let me do some of the general idea and then the specific. The general idea of the politics and corporate governance nexus is that we have a tendency to look at corporate rules and case law, and we often think this is how we could have done it better. If we had just done it this way, the company would be whatever more efficient or fairer, or we get a better set of transactions. A lot of times we couldn't do better because the political foundation, interests, ideologies confine what can be done and what can't be done in corporate lawmaking. Sometimes what happens is we've got a rule. We know we should maneuver and do it differently, but the political confines mean we could only maneuver 10% up or 10% down, and we couldn't move it 50% up and 50% down. So, in one of the books that you mentioned, "Strong Managers, Weak Owners," the idea is in looking at why the United States has so many public companies historically as compared to most other nations. A lot of it depends on the background setup. We in the United States had a weak banking system. For most of the time, we had things called national banks that operated from one street corner. So when companies went national, we didn't have a finance system that could go national. And that meant we developed other modes of financing, stock markets, bond markets, different in other countries. You summarized the backlash article exactly right. And essentially, the why shareholder driven corporate governance failed is an application of the backlash article. The backlash article says sometimes you can do things that seem right from a corporate governance perspective, but it just won't fly politically. And the shareholder driven corporate governance movement of the 2010s found that it couldn't fly politically. The attacks were too severe, and the big three that were promoting the idea of shareholder driven CSR retreated and stopped doing it.
Great. So I want to go step by step. So the title itself is a verdict, right? Because you're saying that it's failed. It's not even a struggle or fell short. And so you make the argument that it's not bad luck or bad timing or a tactical mistake by investors. Just, the failure was written into the premise from the beginning. And so to understand why, I think I'd like to move from your distinction in the paper, what you define as quote unquote broken government, right? Because the premise of a shareholder-driven CSR, which is something that I agree with, right, and described also in my book, is that government is broken and the state cannot work, especially in the U.S. Passing reform is so difficult for gridlock of all sorts. Corporations must step in, right? And it turns out, though, that not all broken government is the same. You make some distinctions there. Can you walk us through what broken government means? Or
Absolutely. So, a foundational premise of shareholder driven corporate social responsibility is American government is broken. We just can't get enough things done, or it's extremely hard to get anything done in Washington. And we've got pressing social, climate, environmental problems. So, while even proponents know it would be better to do this through Washington, but we can't. So let's go for a second best. We can put pressure on the corporation, and the corporation will come around, or we hope that it will come around. So a portion of the article is this will work if the government is broken in one way, but not so much if it's broken in other ways. So if it's broken in the sense that it can't get a carbon tax passed, but it actually can't do anything. So if corporate social responsibility pressures lead to things that reduce the use of carbon and putting hydrocarbons into the atmosphere, then because government is broken and can't do anything, those will stick. and they'll stick long enough so that maybe we can build on that for a different political result. That's one form of government being broken. From a corporate social responsibility activist perspective, there's another aspect of brokenness, which in terms of outcomes is the same, but in terms of analysis is very different. Maybe it's broken from a CSR activist perspective because interest groups were able to block Congress from a carbon tax, say. Well, those same interest groups maybe can block the private action that is doing something in substitution for a carbon tax. So if the oil industry doesn't like a carbon tax, then one possibility is nothing's going to happen if CSR activists get shareholders to push the corporation to get a little more control over carbon. The other possibility is that the oil industry can act and can induce government or some government in the United States, like Texas, to put enough pressure on the corporate social responsibility activists, BlackRock in the 2010s, so that they desist. Third form of brokenness is the people just don't want it. So there's good literature about America's view on gas taxes. And a majority says, yeah, if it's going to help the environment and climate, then yeah, we ought to tax hydrocarbons and gas. But the amount that the typical American is willing to put up with is only a tiny fraction of the actual social cost of hydrocarbons. So middle class people have built their lives around the car, taking their kids to drop them off at work, driving to work, driving to the mall to do shopping. And the idea, I mean, you see it happening now with people react very negatively to rising gas taxes. So some of the brokenness could be the American people just don't believe it's important or don't want to pay for it.
Right. So you mentioned BlackRock, and this is like a very interesting case because it's the most visible one, right? You document the trajectory from Fink's letters to the anti-ESG state legislation, and then BlackRock got scared and said, well, we won't mention ESG anymore because it's too politicized. So became super visible and then reversed the effort. Was that speed surprising to you? And what does it tell us about durability of private shareholder-led initiatives as a mechanism for change, social change or otherwise?
It was fast, only a few years. I guess it was surprising to me. Maybe even more importantly, I think it was very surprising to BlackRock and its senior management. They just didn't expect to be hit as hard as they were hit. If they had expected it, their strategy probably would have been different from the get-go.
And so I want to spend a little more time. You mentioned it earlier when we started, but I want to talk about private ordering again because, we say it normally in our corporate governance circles, one size fits all type regulation is problematic because it doesn't really adapt well to the, specifics of a firm. So it tends to be over and or under inclusive. So private ordering can fix this because you customize, right? But then on the other hand, we see what just happened, right? Private initiatives and commitments are very unstable. You can think about Meta's reversals of all their DEI programs. One day they had their double-decker buses all painted in rainbows, and then the other day before the second inauguration of Trump, Mark Zuckerberg went on video saying that they were dismantling everything. And so I'm wondering if, private ordering is sort of self-regulation tool that without some stickiness features is meant always to have limited mileage, especially now where we have, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world. We have lots and lots and lots of controlling shareholders, much more than we used to, who can pretty much reverse course whenever they want. Before it was a little harder, I think, right? Like some 20 years ago when we're the typical managers, you're responding to several pressures and you cannot pass changes at the corporate level unilaterally, but now they can. What does these tell us about private ordering in general?
And so a couple of things. The most propitious setting for private ordering is when there are no significant externalities, when it's just you and me sitting down, bargaining over how we're going to divide up profits or how we're going to run the corporation. Private ordering works a lot less well when the principal things that we're trying to order are externalities. And for that, that's one of the reasons why we shouldn't expect too much from shareholder-driven corporate social responsibility. The private ordering in itself, even if there were no political pressure on BlackRock to desist, it's hard for it to be very effective when so many people make money by not desisting from polluting. You point out something else. A significant number of the actors you pointed to are individuals that have a controlling interest in major firms. And if they change their mind, even though they made a vow to do X, 5 years later, they think, I don't like X so much after all, and I'm going to do not X. There's not a whole lot that can stop them. In some ways, the CSR pressure has more potential to be effective, even though it's not much, on the public firm with diffuse stock ownership, where the manager's direct financial interest is real, but not the same as a controlling shareholder owning 40% of the stock.
Right. So I want to build on your analysis of how there was a coalition failure that took place, right? You argue that the CSR activists ended up in the wrong coalition. They were allied with BlackRock and financial shareholders, but a more promising alliance would have been with executives, right? If not,
Mhm.
as for the reason we just said, for controlling shareholders themselves. And, this is something that I analyze in my book and argue that executives can co-opt CSR rhetoric. So they use it to expand their own discretion and entrench their position without ever committing to the substance. So if that's the case, then an executive activist coalition may have been also structurally unavailable and not a missed opportunity. But do you think that it could have been built, and what happened to it now, given that again the most powerful firms are increasingly controller dominated?
Okay, yeah, I have two comments on that. One, I agree 100% with your co-optation argument. I think what's happened is executives have largely co-opted CSR, saying, give us more freedom from shareholder oversight so we can do more CSR, and frequently have gotten the freedom of a little bit looser securities law rule and then not really done so much new CSR. The perspective I was taking is from the CSR activist angle. They probably could have been tougher on the executives, and they could have come forward and say, hey, this is meaningless. They don't really mean what they're saying. They're going to back off as soon as you give them this freedom. And the CSR people could have pushed for, we want something that will bind you to the CSR, or we want something else, a seat in the boardroom, something else that binds you to go forward as opposed to you just saying you'll go forward. So that's what I mean by missed opportunity for a coalition. But from a outside of our current discussion, but general corporate governance perspective, I'm kind of glad that that didn't happen. And I feel a little bit shy about mentioning it because I kind of hope that it won't happen. Because from a general corporate governance perspective, we don't need, and we don't want, I don't want, more discretion for managers, directors, CEOs in the public firm. So an excuse to give more discretion, if it works, could very plausibly lead to a less well-run company. And it could lead to, we get a less well-run company, and if the subsequent maneuvering ends up the way it has so far, not much more or not any new CSR. So we could end up with whatever, the worst of both worlds. And it could also, now that I think about it, could also have a negative political effect, is that if we were in a political environment where it was possible to start thinking about a carbon tax, I could imagine some marginal political players would say, well, corporate America, the Business Roundtable have said they're taking care of it. So we really don't have to work hard to figure out a way to take care of it, because they always said that they're going to take care of it. And CSR people kind of signed on when they supported whatever was the regulation was coming down the pipe that would give management more discretion. So a bad idea for general corporate governance, conceivably a better political winning coalition instead of being uh, co-opted and having shareholder-driven corporate governance driven out of the corporation.
And on the last point you mentioned, which is you can have some political intermediary or some political actor disengage in the end because somebody that's taking care of it. This is one of the things that I analyze. Is probably the biggest risk that I flag in my book. Not from the politician's perspective, but from the demand side of politics. I think that is just, as citizens, we should not be expecting corporations to handling this because we want to keep the pressure on our politicians. But we'll come back to this as our dialogue progresses. So, in your 2021 Washington University Law Review paper on corporate purpose and corporate competition, because it adds a layer, and in fact, based on what we just said, it sort of makes the entire picture more complete in a way. So the political paper we just analyzed so far says that even if firms try to do something on CSR, organized interests will block them. But your 2021 competition paper adds that even before we get to politics, most firms in competitive markets cannot really afford to do CSR anyways. Can you please walk us through your paper?
Okay. So the thesis is kind of simple. In very competitive markets, firms can't adopt expensive CSR policies that don't yield a payoff to the firm. Some CSR yields a payoff, better branding, capacity for premium prices. So it's not as though all CSR is unprofitable, but a lot of it is unprofitable. And if it's very unprofitable, it's very expensive as opposed to a little cost here and there. Very competitive firms have trouble doing that. Their competitors will take away market share. They'll have trouble raising new financing. They'll find that their price earnings ratio is unfavorable to the rest of the industry. They might think that they're a potential takeover candidate by somebody who will, if the CSR really is expensive, have a strategy of stopping expensive CSR. There are a lot of firms that aren't in hyper competitive markets. And when they're not in a hyper competitive market, management has discretion. And some of that discretion will be used for their advantage, higher salary, nicer stock options. Some of it will be used out of loyalty to shareholders, bigger dividends, more stock buybacks. But some of it might be used to boost stakeholders, even if unprofitable. You mentioned a couple of questions ago the emergence of controlling shareholders of very large firms. It's quite plausible that the controlling shareholder of a very large firm will think, I have discretion, but I'm going to use the discretion for me. And if I think I get a lot of utility out of being a um, pro-social and being known for it, then I'll spend something on pro-social. If it doesn't really do much for me and it doesn't do much for the image that I want, then I'm not going to be so pro-social, and I'll use the money for my benefit and not anybody else's benefit.
And we've seen that lately with Google co-founder Sergey Brin, who relocated to Nevada after California proposed a billionaire tax, and apparently he's seeking to bankroll the oppositions to this current democratic establishment. So whoever is calling the shots there, and this, as you just said, much more severe of a problem when we're dealing with controlling shareholders who don't really need to be bothered by corporate governance because they have their money, they can put it wherever they want, they can do all the initiatives they want. They don't have fellow directors telling them not to do it. They don't have shareholders or employees. It's their money, right? And so one day the space where CSR, becomes no longer fashionable. There's something else that crosses their mind. They're gonna go for it. And so again, going back to the coalition analysis from before, you got to be aware that these are the actors that are tipping the system one way or the other.
Yeah, a way to put this is that shareholder-driven CSR depends on a particular ownership structure. If it's a controlled company, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and the like will have very little, even less potential to affect the controlled company, even if there weren't any political limits on what they could do overall.
Right. And the interesting thing is that, what history has taught us, as we were mentioned before, is that, the BlackRocks are in a ways less bothered by the power dynamics within the corporation, but they're bothered and they're very scared
Mhm.
of the regulatory environment and and the political pressures that they're getting. So maybe they could get into a corporate governance fight with these controlling shareholders slash CEO for exorbitant pay, but much less so on topics that are against the political winds of a current administration, both at the federal and state level, which, as we know, it's been just as active as the federal.
Maybe I should mention just some of the specifics of the blowback, the backlash that BlackRock faced. So, as many people know, BlackRock sends an annual letter to CEOs. And you mentioned this briefly. In the 2010s, the letters were along the lines of government is broken, we've got to do something. We've got to do something about the environment. We've got to do something about climate change. CEOs, message from your biggest shareholder, you should be paying attention to climate issues, DEI issues, and the like. At the end of the decade, the beginning of the next decade, they face a backlash, particularly from Texas, home of the big oil industry. And portion of the attack was along the lines of BlackRock, you're managing pensioners' funds, Texas citizens' funds, and you're not managing them to get the maximum pension. You're doing it to bring in your political beliefs about how the world should work. So they were attacked. Some money was taken away from some of the big three. Given their size, it's not huge, but it's not the direction that BlackRock wants. They want money coming in, not money going out. There are some lawsuits against them. The most straightforward statement is in 2023, where BlackRock says, we are not the environmental police. This is government's job, not our job. And you can trace parallels in multiple ways. One of the things that we did in the paper is look for mentions of BlackRock and woke in major papers, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and none at the beginning of the 2010s, a sprinkling at the end of the 2010s, and then a big burst up in 2021 and 2022, and then BlackRock withdraws in 2023. And you can map some of this onto the electoral college, is that if you just pick up states that have done something concrete in law, regardless of whether it's effective or not, to favor ESG, and states that have done things to disfavor ESG, there's almost the electoral votes are skewed to the anti ESG side. So BlackRock faced things that they don't want to face. They were essentially trying to develop a national policy on these kinds of CSR, ESG, DEI issues in an American polity that's divided on all these issues. And this puts them in a vulnerable spot.
Yeah, and if I were a minority shareholder of BlackRock itself, of the corporation, one of shareholders who might consider bringing a lawsuit, I would not be too thrilled of having my management and my board so invested into the strategy, and then at the first signs of political wind that change in their attacks, they try to go quiet. They retreat immediately without even trying to make the case that what they were trying to do was actually good for investors and not just for the economy. I mean, there are other papers now that are studying this various responses to the administration. There's a paper by Lisa Fairfax and Veronica Martinez about how the DEI at the corporate level, the DEI reversals were rushed. There are literature out there about how certain law firms responded and certain others didn't respond to the Trump administration, universities. And so one would think that if you occupy the space, if you go bold and tell the CEOs of all companies around the world how you should behave with climate, with other social issues, first, you should have expected that you would raise some political opposition. And then once that political opposition shows up, the moment you're retreating completely and quietly, and you're saying, as you just pointed out, we're not the environmental police, then gives me a very bad taste as how the whole thing was handled. Why were you doing it in the first place?
You would have probably preferred it if, even if they withdraw, that they say something like, we still think the environment is a central issue of our time, climate change is a central issue of our time, but we can't do it privately. The reason, instead of saying we're not the environmental police, is we just need government action to take control of this.
Right, exactly, and say that, there were we say, we're in this business, so we sense that there was a demand at investor level for these type of investments, for these type of initiatives by us as stewards, and we were channeling that. I'm not necessarily one of the biggest fans of what was happening before from BlackRock, but at the same time, I would like to see some coherence. What I see now in sort of the rise and the dramatic fall and how fast the fall was, as we were mentioning before, is that I don't know. It seemed that it was a half-baked idea, but at the same time, it was like a big idea they were trying to push forward. It wasn't that they were doing a small pet project. You open a certain division, or you're trying to launch in a market, doesn't go too well, so you quietly retreat, so it didn't work very well. No, this was like a big statements they were making. They were trying to have corporate CEOs throughout the world to think about certain issues, and all of a sudden they seem to be saying, "Sorry, we can't, and let's not talk about it." So, okay, I want to broaden the scope a little further. A few years ago, you wrote a great book called Missing the Target, which was about short termism. The critique that corporate America is failing all of us because it's too focused on short termism, it's too focused on responding to inputs by certain type of investors who want profits and shareholder returns and increasing the stock price right here and right now. And in that book, you posited that short-termism is a powerful political narrative, but the theory behind it, the facts behind it, are just not convincing. As you may recall, I agree with your analysis there. But when I was looking at the book, the only thing that was bugging me a bit was that Mark is trying to debunk a narrative, right? And there's not another narrative that can beat the existing one. In other words, how do we make progress on externalities, on social issues that bother so many people about American capitalism? And to be honest, I make the same move in my own book where, I analyze corporations in politics as a tool that initially looks promising because again, there's gridlock and all, and so let's give it to a corporation to try to fix it. But also in the book, I say, look, this comes with dangerous strings attached. So here we are. Short-termism is the wrong lever, earning is the wrong lever. And, in CSR also, as we found out, shareholder-driven CSR is the wrong lever too. But then, we're still stuck with inequality, externalities, worker dislocation, you name it. And all the while, populism and nationalism are going quite strong. People will keep reaching for bad tools until the real problems get addressed. And I sort of see that you're getting there also at the end of your new paper in the conclusions. You you mentioned political action is really the end game and the only realistic path. But again, the paper itself shows us that, it's a channel that is blocked by a bunch of forces. So where are we supposed to go?
There's a lot there. Let me see if I can. So on the power of narratives, I use it in the book. Roy Shapiro and I developed it at length in a separate law review article. And the basic idea is nobody except you and me and the listeners of this podcast are going to go and look at the American Economic Review data on this or that problem. The broad populace and most political players will be driven by this makes sense from a narrative perspective. And even if the narrative gets debunked, the narrative can sometimes still win because it's convenient and believable. So the one or two sentence version of it's a short book, but the whole book is a lot of the things that we're talking about as short termism are actually externalities. So there's a lot of thinking and saying, oh, the corporation pollutes because it's short term oriented. This is usually wrong. Short term oriented would mean somehow in the future, a cost is going to come back to the corporation that made the original pollution not worthwhile from a bottom line profit and loss perspective. Most of the time, that's false. It doesn't come back to bite the corporation. if it does come back to bite the corporation, even in some of the egregious cases, it comes back 30 years later and the present value calculation, it still is worthwhile from a profit and loss perspective. It's not short-termism that leads the firm to pollute. It's externalization of a cost. What you point out is right, that most people, and this describes me, probably describes you too, you as well sometimes, you come to a conclusion that this is wrong or this isn't working, and you kind of feel I have to make a contribution as to something that will work. Now, I've reconciled that for me on a couple of these issues in a roundabout way, but I still felt that I had to reconcile it in the sense, this is just psychology, not
Right.
for analysis, and that I think I'm making a contribution because I think we can show that short-termism is not what's causing the pollution environmental problem, and it's externalities. And if we realize that, we're more likely to come to a useful conclusion. And the same thing for shareholder-driven CSR. I can think to myself, you're doing some good, Ro, because I'm trying to show that shareholder-driven CSR is not going to work politically unless the polity is ready to do something on the issue. And then we don't need corporate shareholder-driven CSR. We can just do it directly. So even when I'm putting these negative cases forward, I'm still interpreting it for me as this is a positive. I'm helping to move things along.
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I was thinking as you were mentioning is that maybe short-termism is such a catchier word than externality. Short-termism tells you something immediately versus externality is a little more arcane to the median voter, probably. We should find a different term.
I think you're right. I think short-termism is easy to comprehend even without any technical knowledge, and it has a negative connotation to it. Externalities doesn't have a negative or a positive connotation to the average person. It's what? What do you mean? What is it?
Exactly.
It needs a better phrase,
Right.
and maybe it can't. It needs 4 sentences to explain, and short-termism only needs a phrase to explain.
On the other issue, which is the CSR driven, which we are looking at similar problems from different angle. The way I try to rationalize why my contribution matters is that when it's Meta or Disney or what is handling the hot bottom societal issue, most of the time it becomes a distraction. People will stop talking about that issue, whether it's gun violence, whether it's gender diversity, and they will talk about why is Meta doing it? Why is Disney doing it? Why is Walmart doing it? And you stop discussing the merits that should be discussed at a political level from citizenship, from citizens, right? And instead you're just turning the attention to why is corporation of all the no pun intended people are intervening here. So I think that sort of like is where I try to reconcile the contribution, because we should not like waste too much time trying to defend the entity in and of itself, making those taking those stances, and rather dealing with the issues that are pressing. So this leaves us to who is a viable reformer now, right? With Roy, who you mentioned, and Luca Enriquez, we wrote a piece of how the Europeans were trying to do this, right, with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, but that got even bigger backlash because of all the backlashes that we had from, oil industry, from all the other opponents to shareholder-driven CSR. On top of that, we had the US itself, who wasn't pleased that the EU decided to deal with these issues unilaterally, right? To impose certain hefty ESG-driven obligations for corporations, not just the European ones, but also those who are very present in the European Union market, and therefore a bunch of US multinationals. That, instead of sort of nudging and taking us to an equilibrium, created far bigger problems. The Europeans themselves started to rethink, and maybe we were over-regulating. So they became of another story of miscalculation. Probably, even the Europeans weren't expecting that Trump would be reelected, and it would be even more even bolder in trying to push back. And then, tariff war and all of that made this very, very, very complex. So we're lost also the EU apparently on this.
So yes, in a globalized world, global firms have to be cognizant, or should be cognizant, or if they're not cognizant, it'll be to their detriment, that political pressures can differ from those in the United States. And if they don't plan, they can find themselves in trouble. And that's some of what your article was after. This was a subcategory of BlackRock's miscalculation, probably. They were seeking to conquer new markets. They looked at European pension funds. CSR, ESG issues are more salient in Europe, and many of the funds think it's very important to integrate ESG and CSR issues into their investments. And it's quite plausible that what BlackRock thought is, we're going to show we are pro CSR, ESG, somewhat as a marketing strategy to pull more investment in from Europe. They kind of thought, and I'm projecting, I'm not actually knowing, that they could go a little woke, grab business from Europe without offending political sensibilities in the United States. They miscalculated. They were wrong. They couldn't do both. Differences between the United States and the EU. There are different political cultures, and that's important. Most European nations are more comfortable with government regulation than the US is. Americans value individualism and low government action more highly than most Europeans. At least that's kind of a cliche. But if I had to pick one significant difference here, it's that the EU has no oil industry and the US has a giant hydrocarbon industry with representatives in Congress, significant portion of the voting population, state administrations who are focused on the oil industry. And the EU, except for Norway and Britain, Norway's never been a member of the EU, and Britain is no longer. So the
That's the
EU,
Netherlands maybe with Royal Dutch Shell, but that's the only one.
Okay, all right. Rounding off, the EU has almost no oil industry, and it's central to a significant part of the American economy.
And the one that they have is not shy to lobby with their friends in Texas against and in Louisiana against these initiatives. So, well, Mark, thank you so much. This was such a great conversation. I'm glad that we did this.
Good talking to you for about an hour.
Yes, absolutely. Again, exactly. We'll keep talking about this, I'm sure. Okay, Mark's new paper, Why Shareholder-Driven Corporate Social Responsibility Failed, is linked in the show notes, along with Corporate Purpose, and Corporate Competition, his piece from 2021, and his book, Missing the Target, is published by Oxford University Press. My book, Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, is published by Cambridge University Press. This was Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, an ECGI podcast. All other episodes in the series are available on the ECGI website and wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube. Thank you so much for listening.